Many years ago, a psychologist friend of mine told me something that has stayed with me ever since. He'd had many close people to him die throughout his life, and he told me about the time his brother, a young man, had been tragically killed. And he described how grief-stricken he'd been and how he had wailed and sobbed and felt utterly unable to get over it for many, many months, until something shifted. Now, he told me that one day when the grief started to overcome him in a really overwhelming way, that he just started to purposefully recall all the times his brother had really annoyed him, the times when his brother had been mean and acted in really unlikable ways and made my friend angry. So whenever he felt he was getting overwhelmed by grief again, he simply recalled the times his brother had been mean or selfish. And my friend said, and I quote, "It really helped. Whenever I felt overcome with grief, I'd recall those times he'd angered me, and the really painful part of the grief started to subside. I still loved him, of course, but I found that recalling all those times he'd been a complete jerk really started to stabilize me and enabled me to get through the grief more comfortably." Now, a reflex response to that kind of thing might be, well, that's just denial. You have to feel the full force of your feelings, and so on. But it worked for my friend. And what he was doing turns out to be rooted in something deep in our neurobiology. So here's a question, and you'll see why this is connected in a second. Have you ever wanted to squeeze or bite a puppy or a kitten or a baby because they were just so overwhelmingly cute? Okay, you might not have, but many people have. That strange urge has a name. Psychologists call it cute aggression. It's the harmless impulse to squeeze, bite, or pinch something because it feels almost unbearably adorable. Cultures all over the world recognize this strange urge, so it's a universal thing. And even though the reaction looks aggressive, it's actually triggered by intensely positive emotions: love, joy, and delight. The more technical term is dimorphous expression, which is a fancy way of saying a naturally occurring, paradoxical emotional response in which an intense positive feeling is expressed through a mix of positive and negative behaviors at the same time. So to make that more relatable, think about laughing while crying, or playfully pretending to chomp down on your baby's toes, or the kind of play fighting you see between affectionate couples, screaming out when you're delighted, or that strange urge to giggle when you receive shocking news. So this is all a bit weird. Why would human beings do that? So you feel one thing while expressing the emotions normally associated with its opposite. These kinds of reactions help regulate overwhelming feelings and restore the body to balance. The body is always looking for homeostasis. Things tip too far one way, so the system tips them back the other. Emotional equilibrium, if you think of it like that. It's fascinating, I think, because it shows us that emotions aren't simply about feeling good or bad. They're about maintaining balance in the human being. So what's the point? I'm glad you asked. If this is a natural, common human response, an evolutionary self-regulation mechanism designed to dial down emotional intensity and help the nervous system regain balance, then why not use it therapeutically? Good therapy should just graft onto what nature does anyway. So my psychologist friend was doing exactly that, intentionally and self-therapeutically, using emotion replacement, bringing in the opposite feeling to counterbalance too much of the other kind of feeling, a kind of internalized dimorphous expression to counterbalance overwhelming grief. When we use this phenomenon deliberately in therapy, we call it contrary state therapy. Before I walk you through 3 practical ways to use it, here's a quick one. If you find these ideas useful and want more like them, my free newsletter for therapists and practitioners goes out regularly. It's called Clear Thinking, and you can sign up at unk.com/blog, and the link's in the description below. Okay, right, so there's 3 ways we can introduce contrary state therapy with your clients. The first is simply to ask about opposites. If you've ever watched the rewind technique being used to lift a trauma or phobia, you'll have seen a specific question come up. So we want to know when the client has felt or has had feelings diametrically opposed to the fear, terror, or heartbreak that they've just been describing. So after listening to all the bad stuff, of course, you might say something like, "Thank you for having the courage to talk about what you've just shared with me, and it may seem like a strange question now, but when in your life have you felt completely opposite to that? Maybe safe or more secure or relaxed or even lighthearted? What's the furthest away feeling from what you've just been talking about?" You then have them access those positive feelings and use them as a kind of protective wrapper when deconditioning the traumatic or phobic response. But we can introduce opposite feelings into troublesome emotional states more subtly than that as well. So the second approach is the art of subtle emotional association. When a client is flooded with sadness or fear or shame, we can gently invite a little lightness or appropriate humor or warmth, or encouraging them to recall something endearing. The nervous system generally can't sustain two emotional extremes at once, so introducing a small positive countercurrent can reduce arousal without invalidating what the client is actually feeling. This has to be done naturally or naturalistically and congruently, and only once the client has had time and space to fully express themselves. So I had a client who was often very sad, particularly when she thought and spoke about her failed marriage. Now I discovered quite early on and happily that she was someone I could make laugh fairly easily. And very occasionally I meet people like that. But anyway, for some reason, she seemed to find me amusing, or find that I had the capacity to amuse her, as well as help her in other ways, I hope. And after a while, once we'd done a lot of work together and developed good rapport, whenever she'd bring up her failed marriage, I'd find a way to make her laugh about something else, something at a slight tangent. Not immediately, but maybe a few moments after she'd been talking about the marriage. Now, over time, I noticed she started to spontaneously joke more herself about what had gone wrong in that relationship. And because humor gives us bigger picture thinking, she started to feel more objective and more removed from that failed marriage years ago, and therefore she became less bothered by it. It was an important step in moving forward in the therapy. Now, this kind of subtle conditioning happens in therapy whether we intend it or not. It's happening anyway. Remember, therapy just grafts onto nature. If you think about it, if a therapist frowns or looks pained every time a client brings up a certain subject, the therapist is just trying to be empathetic, the client may become subtly but powerfully conditioned to feel more distressed by that very issue that they're discussing. This is really worth thinking about. When a client expresses self-deprecating or self-hating sentiments, for example, I'm careful not to nod my head as they say these types of things. I might take on a slightly quizzical look instead, or doubting expression. So that's worth thinking about. In moments of distress, intentionally evoking connection through eye contact, a warm tone, or having the client think about a loving relationship can trigger the kind of bonding neurochemistry that counterbalances threat responses. So think of that as a sort of verbal comfort animal. Even accessing memories of tenderness can create a stabilizing opposite effect. We know that people feel less physical pain if they're shown a photo of someone they really love just before they have an injection or are exposed to pain. But we can go further as well. We can make the effects deeper through hypnotic anchoring. So the third approach then is to use hypnotic anchoring, as they call it, a pattern matching process. The process of anchoring can be done in a number of ways, and here's one approach. Using relaxation as the anchor state, though you could equally use confidence or humor or any other resourceful state. Start by progressively relaxing the client. Count them down to a peaceful, relaxing inner place. Watch for the usual signs that they've arrived there: slowed breathing, a slight facial glow, the muscles of the face beginning to slacken. Perhaps the client starts to look a little younger. Resourceful states are much easier to access from here. Then begin using language that evokes those resourceful states. So something like, "Now, there may have been a time when you felt particularly strong or independent or excited by life or connected to other people or humorous or appreciated. And when you notice some of those resourceful feelings beginning to drift through you very powerfully through the hands and feet, perhaps associated with a particular memory, maybe not, then I'd like you to bring that thumb and forefinger together and notice those resourceful feelings even more strongly." A person doesn't need to pin down a specific memory. They just need to access the kinds of feelings that are resourceful. Watch their facial muscles carefully for evidence that the resources are coming through. A slight smile or a more determined set to the jaw, an upward tilt to the chin, whatever it might be. Then suggest that as they part the thumb and finger, they can return to deep rest and relaxation. By doing this, they're beginning to bring the accessing of those resourceful states under their own conscious control. Repeat this process 3 or 4 times, suggesting that each time they bring the finger and thumb together, they can go deeper into those resourceful feelings and experience them even more powerfully. Then ask their unconscious mind to select a future time, perhaps it's an ongoing situation they have, where these resources would be genuinely useful and actually change the very nature of the experience of that situation. A time when they might expect to feel afraid or ashamed or underconfident or whatever. Let them indicate when they've selected that sort of situation through a nod or a hand levitation or whatever it might be. Then on the count of 3, suggest they can drift into that situation in their mind, while at the same time bringing the thumb and finger together. They're bringing opposite feelings into a troublesome situation in order to change the way they feel in that kind of time. Ask them to notice the difference in that situation with all those resourceful feelings available to them. I like to say at this point, because when you're different in a situation, the situation itself becomes a different and new kind of situation. Give them time. Then suggest they part their finger and thumb, drift back into the relaxing place, and take some time in silence to integrate what they've learned. Suggest that in future the fingers may drift together unconsciously when they need to, or they can bring them together consciously, or perhaps they won't even need to think about the thumb and finger because the association has changed so powerfully with that situation for them. Then at the end of that process, you simply count them back out again to normal consciousness. So this uses exactly the same principle my friend stumbled upon all those years ago, using one emotional state to counteract and counterbalance another. Just as people unconsciously and naturally dilute emotional overwhelming feelings whenever those feelings are positive or negative, so too can we use this natural human mechanism of dimorphous expression in our work with clients. Psychotherapists really need to understand psychology. We really must, if we're going to help them change their responses, understand dimorphic expression. But the method should always be gentle and regulating, never dismissive, never forced, never premature. Used skillfully, contrary state therapy helps the nervous system regain equilibrium rather than suppress emotion, because too much of anything in the end is destabilizing. As Thomas Merton put it, happiness is not a matter of intensity, but of balance, order, rhythm, and harmony. Okay, so if you found this useful, I'd love you to come and explore the Practitioner's Toolkit, which is a free resource for you that I put together for therapists and practitioners, and it includes worksheets, relaxation downloads, digital copies of my books, therapy techniques, demonstration videos, and recordings of live Q&A sessions. Everything is in one place, and it costs you nothing, and hopefully it's very useful for you. So head to unk.com/toolkit to take a look, and the link is in the description below. Thanks for watching.